Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It's lovely to be back on the stage of beautiful York Recital Hall. Thank you very much to Dr. Caroline Ahn for helping to organize tonight, and to the School of Music, Theater, and Dance for supporting the faculty recital series. My name is Amy Niffen, and I have named myself the Sassy Violist because, well, I can be a little sassy sometimes. And this is a Sassy Violist program that we would like to offer to you tonight. But before we get started, I'd like to introduce everyone. I'm on viola faculty here, and Stephen Hockey, many of you will recognize, is cello faculty as well. And this is Melissa Deal and Stephen's lovely wife, Sophia Cho Hockey. And we are members of the Indianapolis Symphony Orchestra. We are also occasionally known as the Castleton Quartet. And as I said, tonight we'll be presenting a program that is a Sassy Violist program. And those programs, that's a small business that I develop programs to take into schools in the central Indiana area. And they are programs that use live music and storytelling to harmonize elements of music, history, and social issues. So tonight's program is called Selective Memory. Let me get my clicker. I feel like such a professor with a clicker. Feels so powerful. It's called Selective Memory, Who Gets Remembered and Why? And we're going to take a look at 5 composers. I don't know if Anderson is printing paper recital programs anymore, but if you have one, turn it over, don't look at it, because we're going to play this first piece, and I'm going to quiz you and see who recognizes the composer and who can name the piece. So here's our first selection.
Thank you very much. Raise your hand if you know the composer. Raise your hand if you know the piece. Raise your hand if this was played at your wedding. I played it at probably about 367 weddings, which is why I didn't allow it to be played at mine. This was Mozart, Eine Kleine, the first movement, one of the most famous movements of all Mozart quartets, and he wrote a lot of quartets. So, like I said, the name of this program is called Selective Memory, Who Gets Remembered and Why. Everybody knows Mozart's name. Everybody in the Western Hemisphere, if you're not a musician, if you're don't know very much about classical music, pretty much everybody knows Mozart's name and is familiar with his music. Mozart, as a child, was a prodigy. He was toured around Western Europe and played in courts and concert halls everywhere and impressed everyone, not only with his ability on the keyboard and the violin, but also with his ability to improvise. And he could improvise on anything and be extremely impressive. But every child prodigy has to grow up and claim his place as a mature artist, which Mozart did for the most part in his home country of Austria and to a degree in Italy. But his father said Paris is where you need to make your name, because if you can become known in Paris, then you'll be known all over the world. And this is in the 1770s. So in the summer of 1778, Mozart made his way to Paris. Well, the cute little kid who, in the court of the Austrian princess, had been able to kiss Princess Maria Antonia, could not even get a hearing with the young little girl who had grown up to be Her Royal Majesty Queen Marie Antoinette. He got to Paris and he found the French to be rude and arrogant, and he struggled with the language. Commissions that he had been promised didn't materialize, and so he was struggling financially as well. The orchestra that he was given to showcase his pieces was an inferior orchestra, and that makes marketing very, very difficult. And to make matters not just worse but tragic, his mother was his traveling companion that summer, and she died. So while he's at his very lowest, he's taken in by the Baron von Grimm, and he stays in the Baron's palace for a little while. Well, also staying in the Baron's palace was another young man who was a conductor and a violinist and a composer. He was young and handsome and wealthy and from an aristocratic family. He was popular in the salons. The ladies loved him. He was a friend of the Queen. He was a master marksman. He was a master swordsman. He was a champion swimmer. I mean, this man had pretty much everything. And his name was Joseph Bologna, the Chevalier de Saint-Georges. Raise your hand, do you recognize this name? Right. His name is becoming a little bit more familiar now in the past couple of years, especially since the summer of 2020, when the national conversation really ramped up about representation in the arts. And he has been called the Black Mozart. But given what I just said, I wonder if perhaps Mozart should have been called the White Chevalier, because Mozart was the challenger that summer, and Joseph Bologna was definitely the reigning champion in the city of Paris. He had everything that he wanted, but I also wonder if maybe we could just skip the whole identifying them by black or white, one or the other, and just
consider the content of their music and their character in considering who they were. So here we have a picture of Mozart looking like he just ate a pickle, and Chevalier de Saint-Georges looking very, very suave and handsome. And here we have some of the information about them that I just mentioned. Well, the Chevalier de Saint-Georges was the son of a French aristocrat and his African slave, a young woman named Nanon, and the Chevalier was brought to Paris and given an education as befits the son of an aristocrat. However, because of the color of his skin, there were aspects of French society that were closed to him. He would not, by law, he would not have been allowed to marry the daughter of an aristocrat, and all the women of color were servants. So where does that leave him if he wants to have a family, right? That's a big difficulty. And also, the Queen herself recommended him to the post of the director of the Paris Opera, which was a very covetable post at the time, and he was very well qualified for it. But there were singers who objected to being directed by a man of color, and so he was denied the post. So obviously, the color of his skin had an impact on him and his place in history. However, it was the fact that he was also an aristocrat that proved as much trouble, because, as I said, the information that I just gave was the summer of 1778, which is just short 11 years before the French Revolution. And in order to save himself when the revolution came around, he needed to distance himself from his aristocratic background. He used his own fortune to supply a regiment of soldiers, and he led those soldiers in the revolution, but not even that saved him from imprisonment and the threat of execution. But after the revolution was over, he was never able to regain any degree of position, not to mention wealth, and he died poor and alone in Paris at the age of 53. His estate had been destroyed, much of his music had been destroyed. What is left to history is a few of his violin concertos and 16 of his string quartets. And so the subtitle, Who Gets Remembered and Why, in this gentleman's instance, it's equally as much his color as his station as an aristocrat and everything that happened with the French Revolution. However, his music is charming, and we'd like to offer you two movements of his String Quartet number 5 in G minor for you to consider, having just heard a little bit of Mozart. lovely piece of music, right? Composer that we should have been hearing from, I think, for all these years. So this is a picture from the movie Chevalier. I don't know if you've heard of this movie. It's a very interesting movie. I do recommend it, but be aware that first scene between him and Mozart, that never happened. And I don't know that I'm really allowed to show this picture, so here we go. Moving right along. Our next pair of composers are an interesting pair in that they had quite an in-depth impact on each other. The first one that I'd like to consider is Antonin Dvorak, who was born in what was then called Bohemia. It's changed names several times. Currently it's the Czech Republic. He was a Slav, so he was a minority himself. He was only allowed to go to a certain school, only supposed to have a certain degree of education, but he wanted more because he wanted a musical education, and that was a struggle. His family was extremely poor, and education was costly, but he eventually arrived at a particular competition where Johannes Brahms was a judge, and Brahms was quite taken with his music and recommended it to his own publisher, Simrock, which at the time was similar to getting your music on to the most popular streaming platform, because back in the day, of course, you had to have your music printed, and then actual live people had to play it on their own instruments if you wanted anybody to be able to hear it. So the fact that his music was being mass published was a massive step in the right direction. He became, after Brahms, the most popular or an internationally known composer in all of Western Europe, which is why he was asked to come be the director of a new music school in New York City in the 1890s. It was called the National Conservatory, and not only was he supposed to direct the school, he was also supposed to find indigenous musical material on which to base a specifically American school of composition. And so as he was here in the country, he was listening to the music that he heard around him, and it did have an impact on his own music. One of the pieces that he wrote while he was here is now called the American Quartet, not surprisingly. And in this quartet, I think you'll hear his exposure to the American West, in particular the Great Plains and the mountains. He would have taken a train to Spillville, Iowa in the summers, where there was a large Czech community. And so in this quartet, especially in the last movement, which we're not going to play, sorry, but the last movement, you'll get the motion of a train, but this slow movement is what we're going to play. And for your imagination's sake, I have a landscape. This is my husband's favorite painter, German painter, Albert Bierstadt, who is famous for his landscapes of the American West. And I think that's what you can easily imagine when you hear this movement, the slow movement of Dvorak's American Quartet. piece of music. So, as I said, Anthony Dvorak, his place is secure in music history. We all learned about him, but there was another person at this music school. As I said, Anthony Dvorak was brought here to be the head of this music school. Well, this music school was unique in all of America in that it accepted women and people of color. And so Dvorak, as he's in his studio, he hears someone singing, and the person who's singing is a young man by the name of Harry T. Burleigh, who was working his way through school, a young man of color. And what he's singing intrigued Dvorak because he'd never heard anything like it before. So he invites young Harry into his studio, and Harry sings song after song after song. And what he's singing is slave songs and spirituals. And Dvorak was very interested to hear this. Harry had been taught these songs by his grandfather, who had been a slave, who had worked and bought his own freedom, and he taught his children and his grandchildren these songs. Well, I wonder at the time who would have listened to the music of a minority people like this, except someone who had also been a minority. Dvorak had ears to hear the musical value of what Harry was singing, and he went on to report to his benefactress that he thought this was the music that the American School of Composition should be based on. And I know that there's a word in there that we don't use anymore, which is why I'm not speaking this quote. But if you think 125 years ago, all of the various names that people of color were being called, this one is the most respectful way Dvorak knew to refer to this music. He was trying to elevate this music to the notice of classical musicians and composers, and try to put it on par with the music that he was writing, which no one else besides him, I think, would have done. And so he suggested to young Harry that he write this music down. I'll go back here. So Harry did. He wrote these songs down, and he created about 300 of his own. And now if you mention this name to a vocalist, she or he will say, as one of my daughter's voice teachers said, "Oh yes, Harry T. Burleigh, he's the father of American art song." He essentially created the genre and then established it with his own music and also with his arrangements of slave songs and spirituals. So, as I said, he's the father of, not yet, come on, go back. He's the father of American art song, and we are instrumentalists. So we're not going to be singing for you tonight. He did, however, write a few violin pieces, and we're going to play number 3 of his Southland Sketches, which is a piece for violin and piano. Melissa will play the solo violin part, and the 3 of us have created an accompaniment from the piano part. So we hope you'll enjoy the selection of Harry T. Burleigh. Thank you. I think that's a lovely, lovely view of early 1900s American music. Our last composer on the program is a 20th century American composer named Florence Price. She grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas, in a wealthy family. She had everything she could want. Her mother was her first English piano teacher. She had an extensive library at home. She had access to education and an affluent lifestyle, which was possible in Little Rock, Arkansas at the time because it was not a very segregated town. Her mother was white. Her father was a gentleman of color who had a successful dentist practice, which was unusual because men of color were not allowed to attend dental school. However, he must have been really good at it because he was, as I said, he was quite successful. Florence went to New England Conservatory. She passed as Hispanic to avoid racial issues. She got a job teaching at Clark University in Atlanta, Georgia, fresh out of college. And she married a lawyer. It seemed like her life was everything that she could want. When she and her husband moved to Chicago, it became entirely too apparent that she couldn't stay married to him because he was abusive. So they were divorced, and divorce in the 1930s is different than divorce is now. She bore the brunt of the stigma of being divorced, and a woman trying to do business for herself without either a husband or a father in the 1930s was at a serious disadvantage, because remember, women weren't even allowed to get a credit card in their own name until 1974. So she had herself and two little girls to support, so she played organ in silent movies and she wrote jingles for commercials. Excuse me. And she eventually wound up being part of a movement that became known as the Chicago Black Renaissance, which was artists of a variety of disciplines infusing what had traditionally been known as European artistic disciplines with elements of Black culture. So Marian Anderson, the singer, Langston Hughes, the poet, Margaret Bonds, the pianist, and many others were part of this movement. And she was friends with them, and their various arts impacted each other. She eventually came to notice because she won a competition, and the prize was having her first symphony played by the Chicago Symphony, which is not a bad band. So she began to be known. And some of her music was published during her lifetime and performed, but much of it was almost lost to history. It was found, I think, pretty recently in 2009 in a dilapidated summer home outside of Chicago, and has now been published and is beginning to be performed. In fact, recently in 2020, two of her symphonies, Symphonies 2 and 3, won a Grammy as performed by the Philadelphia Orchestra. Also not a bad band. And the piece that we would like to play for you is from her second string quartet. It's called Juba. Juba is a dance that originated in Africa, came here with people who were brought here as slaves, became popular in the 1800s, and actually morphed into this variety of dances. First the Charleston, and then the Jitterbug. And eventually, this picture right here that says Sigma's Bend, we never break, it's actually a reference to the Divine Nine, what's known as the Divine Nine, the fraternities and sororities of color. Soldiers of color coming back from World War II now had access to GI benefits. So for the first time, this generation of students of color could actually go to college. But when they got there, they found that like the bathrooms and restaurants and hotels, the sororities and fraternities were closed to them, so they began their own. And that is what is now known as the Divine Nine. Sigma Gamma Rho is one of those, and there's a chapter at Butler University. And this dance, Juba, morphed into a variety of things And currently, the current iteration of it is called step dance. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's worth looking up. Sigma Gamma Rho has won multiple national competitions with step dance, and it's super cool. If you haven't seen it, I definitely would look it up on YouTube. So we're going to wind back the clock about 100 years, though, to play Juba for you, which is a delightful, swingy sort of dance. I think you can kind of imagine people in flapper costumes. Hope you enjoy it. Thank you so much for listening to our program tonight and for walking with me through these ideas of who gets remembered and why. And I'll just leave these for you to take a look at, or not. If you're done for tonight, that's fine. But just to consider, just to think about where your place in the story of memory goes. I encourage you to think about how you invest your time, how you value other people, and how we can impact each other as we walk forward in this life together. Thanks again for listening. Have a good night.